Salute BookTube. Welcome back to my channel, the Saracen Salute. I got another video for you today. I'm very excited. Again, I'm a relative rookie on YouTube, but on BookTube, but yeah, I'm going for it, and it's been good so far. I've got a decent amount of views. I'm very happy to say. And I've also got some comments, and that's very exciting. So I wanted to first of all thank you for tuning in and commenting and making me feel welcome on BookTube. It's a relief, and I'm happy to be back and to make another video. So what I did was I looked at my the comments and responded, and hopefully made some new friends. Some of the first comments on my channel, and actually what happened was I got a comment, my very first comment on my channel, on one of my first, probably my first video that I posted up on BookTube, and the comment was from Albert Hancock. First guy, I think it's a guy, most likely, telling from the name, to comment on my channel, and he actually on his comment was actually a question, a request. He had asked if there was any World War II books that I could recommend. So thank you for that question, and I told him in the comments that I would think about it and perhaps make a video, and it just so happens, coincidentally, that after I posted the video and saw the comment, a couple of days later, or well, basically today, the 8th of May, or sorry, yesterday. It was yesterday, but I'm making this video on the 9th, and hopefully I'll post it ASAP. The 8th of May is VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. It's the day where the Allies defeated the Nazis in Europe, and the Nazis surrendered, and peace was restored in Europe. Of course, the war continued in the Pacific for a couple of weeks more, but basically the writing was on the wall, and the Second World War was over. So it was VE Day, and my first comment was a request for some recommendations or some ideas about what kind of World War II books I can perhaps recommend, or what I've read. And as I said, I replied on the comment. You can see it. Although my channel is a BookTube channel, it's all about books, but my focus is mostly history and nonfiction. With that being said, military fiction is not really. I'm not a big military history guy, and I mean there's a subtle difference. Actually, it's not very subtle. I just fixed the chair. It's not very subtle. It's I mean, if you go to a bookstore or perhaps a library, the military history will usually have its own section away from history. That's what I've noticed from the bookstores that I've been to and to libraries that I've been to. Military history is a very specific, specialized, I guess you can say, subject. And most bookstores, most libraries don't mix their military history with their regular history. So there's that. But that being said, again, I'm not a military guy. I've never served in any kind of military. That's not to say that I haven't read military history. I have, but it's just, I don't know, not my specialty. I enjoy it, but again, because I don't have I don't have any kind of military background, sometimes I do find it a little bit challenging, sometimes confusing. Even when a very good author is talking about war, battle tactics, weapons, formations, etc. For a layman, it's I mean, it's still enjoyable to read. I don't know if enjoyable is the right word. It's rewarding to read, and there's a lot to learn from it. But for me, when I read military history, I really need to focus. I need to underline. I need to check things. Refer maybe online to check what's the difference between a battalion and a brigade and a platoon and a division and all of that stuff and ranks and then battlefield tactics, etc. Sometimes when it's visual, it's a bit better for me. That's one of the places where I'm maybe a bit a bit weak when it comes to reading. But I guess practice makes perfect. I think if you keep reading it and then you start to develop, you start to understand better. So that's one thing. That's one thing is I'm not the biggest military history reader. Um, so there's that. That being said, World War II was such a global event. So when you say World War II books, if you mean military history and battles, etc., there's those kinds of books. But then there's a gazillion, literally millions of books, probably hundreds of thousands of books, probably yearly, that are written not just about actual battles, but about the whole overarching era, which was the Second World War. Truly catastrophic war. Just anybody who reads about it and about the casualties and all that, it's quite sobering. Okay, I think my light is kind of burning out. Sorry about that. It went a bit dark, maybe. Hopefully the light won't burn out on me in the middle of the video. I'm already almost 7 minutes in, so I don't want to restart this. So that's one thing, that my military history background is not very, very deep. So please keep that in mind as we go through this video. The second thing I wanted to highlight as well is, well, I mean, okay, I don't read military history that much, but I do have a bunch of books about. I went through my library. I do have quite a few books actually about World War II. I think that's inevitable for anybody who reads history. You're bound to have a couple of books at least one or two about World War II. It's unavoidable. But when I was going through my library, what I did notice was that I have a lot more books about World War One than I do about World War II. And that kind of links with VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. We can say that a large, I don't want to say a majority, but a large part of World War II was fought in Europe. And by Europeans, and then of course the Americans came and joined in, and that also tipped the balance. But it was a very, yes, it's the World War, and there were battles all over the world, but the main theater, or we can say the original theater, well, actually that's not accurate, because Japan actually, one of the major, there's two major battlefields, the European, of course, and the East Asian, Japanese or Pacific theater. Because it's European, I think my Western audience, I'm imagining that most of my audience is European or Western, maybe have a bigger stake in World War II in Europe. They might have family who fought in the war. Maybe they have, like relatives who actually lived through it. So for those kinds of people, World War II hits home. Some of it is in family lore, etc. For me, and again, just to clarify, I'm not in the West. I don't live in the West. I live in the East. I live in the heart of the Middle East, in the United Arab Emirates. So for people in the Middle East, of course, World War II was important and it was significant, but it was not, the Middle East in the Second World War was not a major battlefield or front in the war. That being said, there was a big campaign in northern Africa, everywhere from Morocco, the movie Casablanca, I think, although I haven't seen it, but from Morocco all the way to Egypt, the Libyan deserts, etc., the famous battle between Montgomery, the British General Montgomery, and the German General Rommel, was very important, a very popular battle, I guess is the correct word, during the war, a very significant battle in the war. But the belligerents were mostly Western armies. It was the German army against the British army, and I think there were Italians involved as well on the Axis side. Americans, I'm not too sure about, but definitely British, definitely Germans and Italians. Germans and Italians on one side, and the British on the other. But the actual Middle Eastern soldiers or armies is minimal, I believe, unless I'm mistaken. But from my knowledge of the Second World War, it was mostly Western armies fighting in the Middle Eastern theater or in the North African theater mostly. So there's that. People in the Middle East, the Second World War was, again, maybe not as significant. There wasn't as much at stake personally for the people of the Middle East during the Second World War. Although in hindsight, it turns out that it was important. Now, why was the Middle East not, or Middle Easterners were not very involved in the Second World War? And that goes back to my point about having more books about World War I. The Middle East was a major zone of battle, front. It was a major front in the First World War. The Ottoman Empire was on the side of Germany and Austro-Hungary. And the Ottoman Empire had a land in Eastern Europe, although by the First World War they were pretty much driven out of European mainland. They were the sick man of Europe, and then World War I, basically the sick man died. But what the Ottoman Empire did have during the First World War was vast amounts of territory in the Middle East, countries that became Iraq, Syria, what is now Jordan, Palestine, to an extent Egypt, although Egypt, because of its strategic importance, wasn't a major theater. And then, of course, there's Lawrence of Arabia and his involvement with the Arab uprising in the deserts in what is the Hijaz area of what is now Saudi Arabia, places like Mecca, the Sharif of Mecca, who made an alliance with the British against the Turks. So World War I is very amply represented in my library, because World War I there was a bigger involvement of Middle Eastern armies or Middle Eastern people in the First World War. And then, of course, First World War had huge consequences for the Middle East. That's when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and then the Middle East was divided up into nation states, Arab nation states. The Arabs fought with the Allies, or sided with the British. The British were victorious against the Ottomans eventually, although of course there was the Gallipoli disaster. But the British were ultimately victorious against the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and that whole rump of what was previously an Islamic Ottoman Empire became Arab states, and the British, Sykes-Picot, all of that good stuff, they created a nation state of Iraq based on borders that appealed to their interests. They created Syria and Lebanon and gave that to the French to control. The British controlled Iraq, and they controlled the Holy Land, Palestine. The British were also major naval presence in the Gulf region, what's today the Gulf states. And so, again, World War I, when you ask a Middle Eastern person, World War I will probably feature more prominently because of the significance of what happened after World War I, the victors' peace, basically. And when the British came and defeated the Ottomans and created Arab nation states, the ones we mentioned, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, the Gulf states, they there was the whole Truman, sorry, not Truman, it was the Wilsonian idea that empires should end, nation states and the League of Nations should all be independent, and colonialism should end. But it didn't really end. The British and the French used a very fancy word about giving the Arabs their independence, but the reality was the British and the French in their areas were still in control. They called them mandates, which was a fancy word for we are giving them independence, but we're nurturing them into statehood because they're nascent countries and they need support to civilize or to catch up. We can say that was their reasoning, and so the mandate system was a kind of system in which they did give Arab nations, governments, etc., but the British and the French in their areas were pretty much in control. And this is true from Iraq and the Gulf and Jordan and Syria, all the way to the French positions in Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. Egypt was also under British control. Eventually, Libya would go under Italian control under Benito Mussolini. So all of this history lecture is just going to say that the difference. Well, there's one more thing I should say. So the fact that the Western powers, specifically the British and the French, were controlling the Middle East when World War II came about, because what the British and the French said, we're going to give you local government, things like your budget, taxes, internal affairs. Will let you pretty much, you can take care of that. However, foreign policy, you need to refer to us. That was basically the conditions that the victorious European colonizers gave. So when World War II came about, foreign policy was very much under the British and the French, and then because Italy had a toehold in Libya, there was major battle in North Africa. But that's what I'm trying to say is that's the reason why there wasn't a big involvement of Middle Eastern armies or Arab armies in World War II, because they had deferred most of their foreign policy and their military to the Western powers. And so when World War II came about, the Middle Easterners, the Arabs in the area, were not required, I guess you can say, to serve or to provide men or material, because it was a Western. The Second World War in Europe was really a battle between European powers. So there's that. There's a lot to discuss, but I do feel like a background needs to be provided just to provide some context and just to understand. Again, I think one of the questions on my BookTube newbie tag was, how is your channel fun and unique? The fun part, let's leave to the side, but the unique part I said was I'm based in the Middle East. I can give a bit of a Middle Eastern perspective. So when people say World War II, of course in the West it was a cataclysmic event, and it was as well in the Middle East, but as I mentioned, because these were new states and they were pretty much controlled by the Western powers, the fighting became a Western military issue between Western armies. And for whatever reason, it's an interesting why they never called up Middle Eastern conscripts. When I say Middle Eastern or Arab conscripts, I think there are exceptions. I'm not 100%, but I think the Algerians, the Moroccans, and the Tunisians, perhaps the French. How many of them contributed to the French? I'm a bit spotty on that. So when I say there was no Middle Eastern army involved or Arab people involved, I'm sure there were. I'm just from the from what I know, it was minimal. But I need to check, or you can perhaps check and correct me in the comments about Algerian and Moroccan native involvement with the French army or even with Vichy. I'm a bit spotty there. It could be that they certainly were involved in the First World War. So there's that. And then finally, before I do have World War II books. I promise I'm getting somewhere. But again, just to reiterate and to clarify, Adolf Hitler. One more point I think that needs to be made that's very important. When I said the Middle Eastern people were not involved, they pretty much they were under control of Western powers. But public opinion in the Middle East for the Second World War was wait and see who's the victor, who's the strong horse, and then back whoever was the strong horse. So if you asked Arabic people in 1939, 1940, 1941, there were some people who thought that the Nazis were the future. The Nazis looked like they were winning. By 1941, Hitler was the master of. He controlled everything from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara. I think was the famous phrase that's used. So people thought that the British Empire and the French Empire was pretty much finished. It's over, game over. There's a new sheriff in town, and that's the German Nazi war machine. And we'll get to it when I get to the books. I do have some World War II Middle Eastern books. Despite everything I said, there were events that could have played an important part had things panned out differently during the war. Going back to Adolf Hitler, again, Adolf Hitler was a megalomaniacal ideologue. He had certain ideological targets, and that ideology clouded his strategic vision. He was not very interested in the Middle East, and that's another reason why the Middle East didn't feature prominently in the Second World War as a major front. Adolf Hitler, when it came to the Sahara North Africa campaign, he actually outsourced it to Mussolini and the Italians. He said, the Mediterranean, that's your theater, you take care of that. I'm focused on Europe. He was a very Eurocentric strategic politician. So he outsourced the Mediterranean battle to the Italians. The Italians were no match to the British. And when he saw that the Italians were losing and they were asking the Germans for help, the Germans finally sent Rommel, and there was the battles of North Africa, very famous in World War II. So that's what happened there. And then in the rest of the Middle East, in places like Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, again, Adolf Hitler was not interested. They're Semitic people. He wasn't very fond of Semitic people. And it was that disregard for the Middle East and for the Arab world really hurt him, because he could have probably had a toehold in the Middle East, and if he had been more of a strategic thinker, he might have been able to seriously harm the Allies even more than he actually did. And I say that because, I mean, you need to remember these Arabic countries were newly independent, but they had these colonial overlords, the French and the British. So the Middle Eastern people, there were nationalistic Middle Eastern Arabs who I'm losing my train of thought. Middle Eastern Arabs who were anti-British and anti-French. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think that makes sense. The enemy, Nazi, of my enemy, the British and French colonialism, is my friend. And so had Adolf Hitler, and there were ambassadors, Nazi ambassadors in the Middle East, begging him begging him to open a front in the Middle East. You've got supporters here. The people of the Arabs of the Middle East are living under the yoke of British and French colonialism. They would probably welcome you if you came and attacked the Middle East and opened the Middle Eastern Front. And added to that, of course, was the whole Zionist movement that was happening in the Holy Land. The Arabs from really after the First World War and the Balfour Declaration became aware that the British had promised the Jews of Europe a homeland in Palestine. That was the whole Zionist movement, and their numbers were growing even before World War II and the Holocaust. And it was noticeable, and there were skirmishes in the 1930s in Palestine. And a lot of the Arabic countries around in the region were pretty heated up about the existence of European Jews coming in large numbers to settle in Palestine and buying up land and setting up local governments, and Hitler's hatred of Jews, of Judaism, Jewishness, Jews. Again, there could have been a coalescence of interest to say, look, you don't like, I don't like to talk like this, but you don't like the Jews, and the Middle East was not happy about the Zionist project. We can work together. And there were discussions. There's the famous photo. I wish I could edit. I'm too much of a rookie, but there's a famous photo. You can Google it, where the Imam of Jerusalem, went to Berlin and met Adolf Hitler, and told him, "Look, you don't like the Jews. Hey, we're having a problem with the Jews, in air quotes, as well. Let's try to work something out." But again, Adolf Hitler was the ideologue and not a great propagandist, but not a very good overall strategic thinker. He never opened the front on in the Middle East in the Second World War, and he was obsessed with Russia. So in 1941, he was controlling everything. He could have gone into the Middle East, and the Middle East had oil. He could have got the oil from the Middle East. He would have had a pliant population. He really could have caused more damage than he actually did. He could have perhaps won. Who knows? It's in the what if of history. But he could have gotten the oil from the Middle East. He could have knocked out the British and the French out of the Middle East. He could have had a whole control of the entire Middle East, middle of the world, basically. But he was obsessed with Russia, and then he did Operation Barbarossa. It was a disaster, and that was the beginning of the end. And his whole idea was, yes, we hate the Slavs of Russia, and we need to kill the Jewish Bolshevism. But he was also after the oil fields of Russia, but he could have gone to the oil fields of the Middle East. He could have got that, and then once he had secured the Middle East, he could have gone and attacked Russia. He didn't have to go through Moscow or Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, or Stalingrad, which is, I think, Volgograd today. He didn't have to do all of that and look bloody. He could have reached the oil fields of Azerbaijan and Baku through the Middle East, but he didn't. Strategic blunder. Basically led one of the reasons, a major reason why the Nazis were not ultimately victorious in the war. So, with that half an hour throat clearing, I just wanted to set up the background, just to set it up and to clarify. I hope it was interesting. But now we'll go to the books. So when Albert Hancock had asked about World War II books, again, whatever I recommend now, I'm going to show you some overall World War II books that I have. A few pigeonholed sort of World War II books about specific battles. I'll explain when I talk about the books why I have these specific ones. And then I'm going to show you some books about the effects of World War II in the Middle East. Because there was, I'll get to it when we get to the books, because I don't want to overcomplicate just for now. So the books, the general books that I recommend, or that I have in my library that concern World War II, I mean, there's when it comes to general European battlefields, I don't have anything. I don't think that is some sort of uh, unheard of book or something that's not. I mean, most of the books I'm going to show you, probably most bookish people are probably aware of it. So to start with, I think the best general World War II book that I've read, and I haven't read that many, but one that I read and that was really good is by Andrew Roberts. It's The Storm of War. I've got a paperback edition of it. It's well read, well loved. I think I've read it twice, but it's really, really good World War II history. Again, very popular. It's nothing that I would doubt. Um, Armchair generals who like to read about World War II don't know about this book. I think what's the subtitle? It's A New History of the Second World War, but very well written, and a historian really at the top of his game. Pretty much covers everything in one volume. It's big, but it's not that big. You can write a 50-volume history of the Second World War if you really wanted to, but in one volume, this is probably the best thing to give you the overall entire World War II picture in one volume. So this one I can recommend. I've got some other books. Some of them are on my TBR. I haven't read them, but I know a little bit about them when I read on reviews, etc. before I purchased the books. One of them is this one by Richard Overy. It's called Blood and Ruins. And the subtitle, which is important, is The Great Imperial War, 1931 to 1945. And I think Overy in this book takes again, I think the key word there is imperial, the Imperial War. Nobody calls the Second World War the Imperial War, but the argument that Overy makes is that it was an imperial war. And there's a lot of focus on Japan and Japan's empire, German Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire. They all existed. World War I severely curtailed them, especially the French and the British, but they were still pretty much empires. That's the understanding I get from the argument that Overy makes in this book. But it's again very big, but one volume, which is merciful, although very, very small text. So a lot of information. Again, I haven't read it, but the reviews it gets, very highly highly praised book. So something perhaps you should consider. Another book by an American historian. This is Victor Davis Hanson, The Second World Wars, plural. And here the argument that Victor Davis Hanson makes, I got to know, I became familiar with Victor Davis Hanson, especially after September 11th. He wrote books. He was very pro-Iraq War. I actually have it right here within reach. It's this book, An Autumn of War. How America Learned from September 11, What America Learned from September 11, and the War on Terrorism. So this is just pretty much America in Afghanistan and why it's the good war and why they should continue. But here he just goes into World War II. So he's a classicist and a historian. But then again, it's plural, the word wars. And the argument that he makes is that World War II, although it's combined into one great war, it's really many different theaters. And the argument he makes in this book very well, with a lot of facts, again, another big book, but again, mercifully one volume. The argument he makes is that the German army and the Italian army to an extent, and the Japanese as well, were unable to fight a two-front war. Ultimately, at the beginning, the German army, when they had a head start by militarizing, were able to conquer, and they were able to conquer small countries. Hitler, he invaded Denmark. He invaded Czechoslovakia. He did an Anschluss with Austria. Greece. I'm not disrespecting these countries, but they're small countries. You would expect Germany to defeat them. But when it became a global war, the Germans had no chance. It's similar with Japan, although Japan controlled a lot of China. But again, China in those days was not the China of today. It was a much weaker China than what we imagine today. So the Japanese had the same issue. But then when they faced the Americans, the Soviets and the British, but mostly the Americans, they stood no chance. He argues a lot about the war production of America, the prolific war production of America, completely, and the war production of the Soviet Union, but mostly America, an American author, American-centric. How their war production, their superiority eventually told, and were ultimately victorious. The Allies were ultimately victorious. So that's another one. And then one book which isn't military history, although it does get into the military, and this is more of a history of Nazi Germany, very, very well known. I'm sure you know it. This is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shirer. William Shirer. Very good book. I bought this when I was in university, and I read it. I haven't read it since then. I read it when I got it, and it's been a while. There's a swastika. What I'm hoping now is that the template when I post this video isn't my face with the swastika. So maybe I won't put it too prominently. But basically, what Schreier, what he wasn't a historian per se. Although this is a history and it's magnificently written. It's written like he was a journalist, so it's written with a journalistic sort of prose, which is refreshing. He was second. He was. I don't recall which newspaper had sent him. Had embedded him into Nazi Germany, but he was an American reporter in Germany with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, and so he had a first-hand account of the war or of the rise of Nazi Germany. He saw it firsthand, and these are his recollections, and then what happens after the fall and the defeat, etc. So, really, really good World War II. History over here, highly recommended. Again, from somebody who was on the ground in Nazi Germany as Adolf Hitler's rise to power, and also just very well written with a journalistic style that befits a journalist. So, yeah, really, really good. And that book sort of, I'm not finished yet. This video is going long. I'm not finished yet, but that concludes the more general histories that I have in my library. Again, I don't think there's anything that's perhaps that you probably haven't heard of, but those are what I have. Modest World War II history, military histories. But I do have other books which are more keyhole. I think I said pigeonhole. Keyhole histories, that's what I meant to say. More specific theaters and books on one specific theater. And what you're going to notice from the books that I do have, I purchased these books with an idea in my mind. I know I started this whole video saying that I'm not very interested in World War II and military history per se, but I actually have a writing project of my own. I've been thinking about a novel, writing a novel. I know I read only history and nonfiction, but I'm trying to write a novel. But my novel is more. It's an espionage sort of book, but it's not a thriller. It's more of a historical fiction with an espionage type story, and I've already thought of a whole series of the books. Like I can go in chronological order, but the majority of the book is the plot revolves around things happening pre-World War II, before the war starts. There might be a book about something that's happening in the war, and then I have some ideas about continuing the story after the war, with the Cold War, especially. I'll get more into the my idea a little bit later, but why I mentioned this was because a lot of the books that I have, you're gonna see, I was a little bit interested in the Mediterranean theater. I just wanted to understand it better. When I say Middle Eastern theater, it's a lot of it is involves Italy and Benito Mussolini, which is an area I'm not 100% as knowledgeable as, let's say, the Nazi German, or yeah, basically I'm not very aware of the Mediterranean, of the Italian viewpoint of the war. And because my story sort of is based in the Middle East, but in the Middle East you can include the Mediterranean, I'm very interested to know about the war front in the Mediterranean. And when I say Mediterranean, it's the whole swath. It starts in Spain. There was a civil war in Spain between fascists and socialists. And the fascists were ultimately victorious, and that kept them in the orbit of at least neutral with respect to Nazi Germany and fascist Italy under General Franco. But then there was things like Gibraltar, Malta, places like Cyprus, Sicily. And these places, they became Greece. Greece is another big one. They became major fronts in the war, but the question was why? The British, because they were a naval power, pretty much controlled the Mediterranean, but there wasn't really much of a threat. Adolf Hitler wasn't interested in the Mediterranean. He was interested a bit in Western Europe, France mostly, Northern Europe, the Scandinavian countries, because they were racially related. And then he was obsessed with the Eastern Slavic menace, as he called it, and Russia, ultimately Russia. He wasn't too much interested in the Mediterranean. The Russians were, before World War II, weren't very involved in the Mediterranean. The French had the Mediterranean power, but they were very much allied with the British at this point. So the question is, why did the British use up so much resources and men and blood and treasure to protect these Mediterranean islands? I think the answer is they had notions of grandeur, of continuing their empire. They didn't want, I think, really up until the end, they thought maybe we can recover our empire after the Second World War. And so I'm just interested in that, and I don't know much about it. So I got a couple of books just to understand that theater, especially the situation before the war. So for one an example of a book I have here is called Defending the Rock. It's by Nicholas Rankin, and the subtitle is Gibraltar and the Second World War. So, why did Britain fight tooth and nail to protect Gibraltar? And I think there is a Vichy element. Of course, the Italians. The only threat was really the Italians, but the Italians were never. They were, with all due respect to any Italians watching this, they were never a serious threat to the British Empire. Just in terms of size of the country, material, etc. So that's one book, just to better understand the Mediterranean front. Another one, similar, is by James Holland, and it's called Fortress Malta, an island under siege, 1940 to 1943. Again, major bombing campaign for Malta. I think the Germans eventually said, okay, no, we need to control the Mediterranean. They got involved, and I think because they saw that the Italians weren't able to cope with the British and the other allies. So once Hitler went full throttle in the Mediterranean, perhaps maybe too late, but there was a lot of bombing. And again, the British, and the Maltese, of course, huge sacrifices to protect these small islands, which I understand are geostrategically important, but they were geostrategically important if you have the British Navy and the British Empire. But I think the writing was on the wall pretty early. Oops, again, the lights. The writing was on the wall pretty early that the British Empire wouldn't be coming back, that they really need to put that much resources into Malta, Gibraltar. Again, small countries, really tiny countries. But geostrategically important. This is another one. This is Target Italy. The Secret War Against Mussolini, 1940 to 1943. Very similar, Malta, and then Sicily, then Italy. Just that whole sweep again. I don't know. These books, again, I got them more for research purposes, just to understand better, because the novel idea I have was to set up the world, my world building for my novel. I need to understand the Mediterranean a bit better, the Mediterranean front. So this is another book in similar vein as the other ones I showed. And then finally, for Keyhole Histories, this one also, again, research for my novel. I wanted to know more about the airplanes, the air war, and how airplanes and aviation in that period, still relatively early in aviation history. I want to know more about it. So I found this book. It's called Spitfire by John Nichol. And that's about the British bomber, the Spitfire, which was heavily used in the Second World War. Again, just wanted to understand aviation, and a lot of the books I mentioned in Malta, Gibraltar, there was a lot of air wars going on over there. So I grabbed this again for research purposes. I haven't read this, but hopefully it's good. Maybe I can take out some nuggets of information from it. So now, okay, oh my God, we're 45 minutes, more 46 minutes. I'm gonna try to keep this under an hour, but I can't stop now because we're coming to the piece de la résistance. We mentioned the European front, which again, because of my background, it's important, but I don't have much of a stake in Europe, so my library in that theater is minimal. I showed you the books that I do have, very general histories, very well-known ones. I was interested in the Mediterranean more because for research purposes for my own book. Stay tuned for that. I'm working on it. For a long time working on it, but hopefully maybe I can find some closure one of these days. Of course, there was the Far Eastern Front. I found in my library one book about the Eastern Front. Again, Japan, Indonesia, Singapore, China, of course, all that stuff, the Pacific Islands, etc., Australia. Again, not much of a personal stake in that, so my interest is come see, come sa, 50-50, but I have one book, and it's by Barbara Tuchman, and it's Stilwell and the American Experience in China, 1911 to 1945. And unfortunately, this book, I found it in a free library cover. The book is in actually good condition, it's still readable, but it's just the front cover has fallen off, unfortunately, so I don't know what I can do with this. I read this book. Barbara Tuchman is a favorite of mine, as a history buff. She's written about World War I, late 19th century history of Europe and America. She's written The Guns of August about World War I. She also has a book about the 13th century. She also has a book about the Middle East, about the conflict between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East. One of her earlier books. But this is also one of her earlier books, and it's about Stilwell. I read this a while ago, but Vinegar Joe Stilwell, that's his name. I forgot his name. He was in charge, he was put in charge, he was the commander-in-chief of the Chinese theater. The Chinese is before Mao Zedong and the communists, although they were around. There was Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was the generalissimo of China, a strong American ally. The Americans helped him as much as they could. His verdict in history, Stilwell himself was not a big fan. And I think ultimately it was true. After the Second World War, Chiang Kai-shek lost China. He lost it to Mao Zedong and the communists. And he was pretty ineffectual against the Japanese army. And I don't know how much is his fault. I mean, China was pretty much it was in a very weak state, so there wasn't really much they can do. There was strong colonial indirect control of China, and that sort of restricted them as well. But this is the only book I have about the Eastern Asian front. Again, because it's just a little bit out of my interest because of my background, my Middle Eastern background. So that leaves between the European front, the Mediterranean, and the Far East, there still is the Middle East. The Middle East was still uh, a theater of the war, albeit a secondary theater, not a major theater. But now I'm going to get to the books about the Middle East, World War II in the Middle East. Now, again, I'm going to 10 minutes. Let's see if I can do it in 10 minutes. I just give a little bit of background. Like I said earlier in the video, the Middle Eastern newly created Arab states of the Middle East were independent only in name. In reality, the British and the French were pretty much in control, especially of foreign policy. And because of that, there was a lot of anger among the nationalists, Arab nationalists in the countries of the various Arabic countries of the Middle East, many of whom said, hey, why don't we ally with Nazi Germany and kick the British and the French out? This is our chance. These nationalists were angry because their country was still not independent of Western control. And they were also pretty angry because of the Zionist project that was slowly building up in Palestine. So those two fronts was really would characterize the rest of Middle Eastern history up to today about Western intervention in the Middle East. The books I have about the Middle East concern Iraq. Iraq, in 1941, there was a coup in Iraq. There was a pro-British monarchy in Iraq put by the British to serve the interests of the British. And that monarchy found itself facing a coup. And this coup was organized by a bunch of Arab nationalists who said Adolf Hitler is the future, Nazism is the future, fascism is the future. And so what these did, they banded together and they overthrew the monarchy in Iraq. They overthrew the monarchy of Iraq. The king of Iraq at the time, the king was a young boy, so there was a regent. Actually, this is all about my novel about the one I'm working on is about this. It's Iraq under Nazi control, the Nazi government in Iraq, and the whole story behind that. It's very interesting and one that isn't very well known in Western audiences, considering, especially in America and Britain, the amount of involvement in Iraq. I feel like their history of Iraq before Saddam Hussein, early 20th century, mid 20th century Iraqi history is very minimal. But basically, the king and his regent, his uncle, were driven out of Iraq, and a pro-Nazi government came into power in Iraq. And this was a threat. It was a threat to the Britain. If Iraq, with its rich oil reserves, went completely and joined the Nazi coalition, then the British and their need for oil were in big trouble. And so there was a war, the Anglo-Iraqi War of 1941, in which the British RAF, the Royal Air Force, and British soldiers invaded Iraq, removed this pro-Nazi government, reinstituted the monarchy, brought them back from, they were like in diaspora, they were kicked out of the country, they were brought back and put back in power. I'm forgetting the word, but exile. They were exiled and then they were brought back by the British on the back of British trucks and reinstalled into power in Iraq. For anybody who's interested in the gentleman who organized the Nazi coup of Iraq, his name was Gailani, Rashid Ali Gailani. Maybe you can Wikipedia him, or perhaps, I don't know how many books there are. If there is a single book in English about him, there should be. If not just him, then the whole movement. So there was an Anglo-Iraqi war. There was an Anglo-Iraqi war in 1920. There was an Iraqi-Anglo war in 1941. And then there was an Anglo-Iraqi-American war in 2003. It wasn't the first time. It was the third time. You can argue the fourth time if you include the Kuwait war and the bombing during Desert Fox. Maybe that's fifth war. There's been multiple wars in the 20th and very early 21st century between Western powers and Iraq specifically. So there was a war. It was a very quick war, though. The Iraqi army really couldn't face the British army. So Britain came in, removed the pro-Nazi government, reinstalled the Iraqi monarchy in a very short matter of time. It was very quick war. It didn't last too long. But there was battles, and there's a couple of books about them that I'd like to share with you guys now. One of them is this. It's Hitler's Gulf War, The Fight for Iraq, 1941, and this is by Barry G. James. Barry G. James, Hitler's Gulf War. Again, you can see it was a big aerial battle, but it was also a land battle. The names just right now escape me, but again, Hitler, one of the reasons why Britain was very successful in quickly removing the pro-Nazi government in Iraq was that Hitler really didn't give too much support. They launched the coup and they were pro-Nazi and they said, "Hey, Germany, come and help us." Hitler was focused on Russia. So the title is a bit misleading. Hitler's Gulf War. Hitler wasn't really too involved, but the pro-Nazi government, I think that's what he's referring to. The pro-Hitler government and the war in the Gulf in 1941. So that's the first book. Second book is by Ashley Jackson. It's The Persian Gulf Command, A History of the Second World War in Iran and Iraq. You can see the map there, very nice cover. This is from Yale University, so it's good to know that there's a university press who's familiar with this pretty sizable book. This one also includes Iran. I haven't spoken about Iran. I haven't spoken about Turkey, but Turkey was neutral, and I think that's a big reason why the Middle Eastern front in World War II wasn't as large as it was. It could have been if Turkey had chosen a side, perhaps. Same with Iran. Iran also went similar. The Shah in Iran, who was ostensibly pro-Western, once he saw the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler gaining victory after victory after victory, slowly tilted towards the Nazis. It's one of the biggest reasons why Iran, before the 1930s, was always referred to as Persia. But then, to placate and to appease Hitler, the Shah of Iran at the time changed the name from Persia to Iran. And the term Iran connotes the word Aryan. The Iranians wanted to show Adolf Hitler that we're Aryans as well, and that the actual word Aryan is a Persian word. And so Persia became Iran, which is linked to Aryan. They're an Aryan people. Iranians are not Arabs. They're not Semitic. Their language, at least. So this is, again, similar story. I think this one goes more into Iran because after the British defeated the pro-Nazi government in Iraq, they went into, they actually removed a Vichy government in Syria. I won't get into that. They got into Iraq, then they continue into Iran, and then they open a front to Russia, and that's the whole Lend-Lease. That's how Americans and the British were supplying Joseph Stalin with weapons. It was through Iran, through Iraq and Iran, the Gulf port, through Iran to Russia. So again, very, very happy to have this. Next is another one, similar subject matter. This is called Blood, Oil, and the Axis. The Allied Resistance Against a Fascist State in Iraq and the Levant in 1941. And it's by John Broich. Broich. John Broich. He's the author of Squadron. Don't know about that, but this is, yeah, basically similar story. The word oil is there, and the word Axis is there, and the word Levant is there as well. So Iraq was the main, because it was a very pro-Nazi government that came in power, and because of the oil in Iraq, Iraq took central concern among the Allies, among the British especially. They needed to remove any kind of Nazi sympathy in Iraq because of the oil. But there was also the Levant. I'm not as aware as the Levant, but what I do know was the Levant was that Levant is Syria and Lebanon, was under French control before the Second World War, and when France collapsed to Hitler's armies, a Vichy government in Syria took over. So again, if Adolf Hitler had been more strategically or less impulsive and more strategically sober, he had Lebanon, he had Syria, he had a very friendly Palestine, angry about increased Jewish immigration. He had Iraq. There was a coup. Iran changed their name to be pro-German. He could have really taken over if he really wanted to, but he didn't want to. He obsessed with Slavic Bolshevism. And so, so again, another book on the subject. And then, okay, I've already crossed the 1 hour, but there's one last book. I promise that I'll end this. I really apologize for going on and on and on. But the last one, again, similar subject matter. This is War of Shadows. The subtitle is Codebreakers, Spies, and the Secret Struggle to Drive the Nazis from the Middle East. And it's by Gershom Gorenberg. So again, similar. There's a bit of espionage, I think, with the code breakers and the word spies. So that was very interesting for me. Again, all this is research for my novelistic idea that I hope one day to publish. Who knows? But there's another book, again, similar, what we've been talking about. Pro-Nazi government in the Middle East, got no support from Mussolini, no support from Hitler, ultimately collapsed because of British intervention, decisive British intervention. Eventually the British and the other allies, the Americans, the Soviets, the French, etc., were ultimately victorious. I'm going to end this booktube. Thank you so much if you stayed this long. I apologize for the length. I'll see you in the next video. Salute.